Well, first of all, this is very directed. The exact words that are chosen and the words that are said are definitely directed by our behavioral analysis unit of the FBI. And what they're trying to make happen is hopefully contact and hopefully a way to open up communication.
There are cases that confuse everyone. And then there are cases that confuse everyone except the one person in the room who has seen this before. Jennifer Coffindafer was that person. She did not come to the Nancy Guthrie investigation with a theory. She came with 28 years. 28 years inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 28 years of building cases, reading evidence, sitting across tables from people who had done things most human beings cannot imagine. 28 years of learning how predators think, how they plan, how they execute, and most importantly, how they reveal themselves in the details they believe nobody will ever notice. She is not a television personality. She is not someone who discovered true crime during a pandemic and built an audience around it. Jennifer Coffindafer is the kind of person who walked into rooms that changed her permanently, and kept walking in anyway, because that was the job. When Nancy Guthrie disappeared on the morning of February 1, 2026, the public response was confusion. The media response was chaos. The official response from Pima County was, as Coffindaffer would later make very clear, something far worse than confusion.
Well, proof of life is typically critical. The FBI will not recommend sending anything, but again, these are recommendations. It is truly up to the family because it is their loved one and that life that is in the balance. So it is up to them to make the decision. And
But Jennifer Coffindafer was not confused. Not for a single day. By day 2, she was already telling the public something that most people were not ready to hear. She had looked at the doorbell footage. The masked figure. The deliberate walk toward the camera. The head tilted down at exactly the right angle. No hesitation. No scanning the environment the way a stranger would. No pause. Straight to the device. She said it plainly. The person who approached that door keeps their head down and heads straight for the camera. They knew exactly where it was. One sentence. That was all it took. Because in 28 years of FBI work, Jennifer Coffindafer had learned something that cannot be taught in a classroom. The difference between a stranger crime and a targeted crime is not hidden in the forensics report. It is not buried in the autopsy or locked inside the suspect's phone. It lives in the first 3 seconds of surveillance footage. It lives in the body language of someone who has been to that location before. Someone who already knew where to look. Someone who had already memorized what needed to be removed.
well, I tell you what, it was such a juxtaposition as to the sheriff's position in this case. I mean, when you listened just hours earlier to the sheriff say, no suspects, everyone's a suspect, we don't know, then you see the reward going up to $50,000. You see a complete reinvention.
Hi viewers, here is a question that has been dividing everyone following this case. Do you believe Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was planned by someone close to the family, yes or no? Drop your answer in the comments right now. What Coffindaffer saw in those 3 seconds was not just criminal behavior. It was familiarity, and familiarity in a case like this is not a small detail. Familiarity is everything. Think about what it means to walk directly to a doorbell camera in the dark, in a mask, at 1:47 in the morning, and remove it from the wall without looking for it first. Without scanning, without hesitation. That is not the behavior of someone who researched the property from a distance. That is the behavior of someone who had stood at that door before. Someone who had rung that bell before. Someone who had been welcomed inside. Coffindaffer knew, and what she knew pointed somewhere specific. Not toward a random stranger. Not toward a drifter or an opportunist who had spotted an elderly woman living alone in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. The evidence pointed inward, toward something closer, something more dangerous than a stranger in the dark. She had seen this pattern before. Not once, many times. And every time she had seen it, the thread that unraveled the case was the same thread everyone else had walked right past. The thread of someone who already knew the house. Here is what made Nancy Guthrie's home significant. It was not a random address on a random street. It was a private residence in a gated area of Tucson. An 84-year-old woman lived there alone. She used a walker to move through the rooms. Her pacemaker, a device implanted to regulate her heart, transmitted data to her healthcare provider every single night at exactly 2:28 in the morning. The property had a Google Nest doorbell camera at the front entrance. It had a security gate at the driveway. It had multiple entry points, including rear doors that opened onto a back section of the property.
Neighbors within a 2-mile radius are being asked for any video from January 1st to February 2nd to look for any vehicles or people that look out of place.
This is a targeted kidnapping. That person didn't just show up there that day and wonder, geez, will she be here? Will she be at home? They knew who she was. They knew her home.
From the street, it looked ordinary. A retired woman's home. Quiet, modest, private. But Coffindaffer was not looking at it from the street. She was looking at it the way she had looked at crime scenes for nearly 3 decades. And what she saw was a location that had been studied. A location that had been prepared. A location where someone had already been inside, already walked the hallways, already understood the layout, and had left something specific behind before they ever returned that night. The rear doors of Nancy Guthrie's home were found propped open. Not broken, not forced, propped. That one word changes everything. A stranger casing a property from the outside does not get access to the rear of a secured home to prop a door open from the inside. A stranger conducting surveillance from the street does not walk through the interior of that home in advance. But someone who had been invited inside before. Someone who had moved through those rooms, who knew which door led where, who understood exactly which exit would allow a person to move quickly and quietly in the dark without triggering attention from the front of the property. That person could prop a door. That person could leave a specific point of entry unlocked and ready, and then come back for it in the early hours of a February morning when an 84-year-old woman was asleep and her pacemaker had not yet transmitted. Coffindaffer laid this out with the kind of calm that only comes from having done this work for so long that the horror no longer disrupts the analysis. She was not performing outrage. She was not speculating for an audience. She was doing what the FBI had paid her to do for 28 years. She was reading the evidence. And the evidence was reading back. By day 2, Jennifer Coffindafer already knew the shape of this crime. And the shape had a name. She did not say it publicly. Not yet. But in every interview she gave, in every breakdown she put on record, in every piece of analysis she offered to Newsweek, to broadcast networks, to anyone paying close enough attention, she was circling. Methodically, precisely, the way she had circled suspects for nearly 3 decades inside the FBI. She was circling someone who had not been standing outside in the dark that night. Someone who had never needed to be. 9:50 in the evening. January 31st, 2026. Nancy Guthrie arrived home after a family dinner. Someone drove her there. Someone who knew the address without typing it into a navigation app. Someone who had been to that house many times before. Who had sat in those rooms, eaten at that table, walked through those hallways. Who knew which lights Nancy turned on when she came home late. Who knew exactly how long it took her to move from the front door to her bedroom with a walker. That person watched her go inside. And then that person drove away. 3 hours and 57 minutes later, a masked figure appeared at Nancy Guthrie's front door. That window. That specific window of 3 hours and 57 minutes. Jennifer Coffindafer returned to it repeatedly. Not because she was building a dramatic narrative. Because she was doing what the FBI trained her to do. She was following the math of the crime. And the math kept pointing to the same place. 3 hours and 57 minutes is enough time to drive somewhere and return. It is enough time to change clothing and gather materials. It is enough time for someone who already knew a rear door had been propped open to position themselves in the dark, wait for the lights inside the house to go quiet, and move. Think about that. Not a stranger arriving and improvising. Not someone stumbling onto an opportunity. Someone who knew the schedule. Someone who understood that an 84-year-old woman who had just returned from dinner would take time to settle, to prepare for bed, to fall asleep. Someone who calculated the window between when Nancy's eyes closed and when her pacemaker would transmit its nightly signal at 2:28 in the morning. That calculation did not come from surveillance. It came from knowledge. At 1:47 in the morning, the masked figure appeared at the front of the property. Head down, path direct, zero hesitation. The Google Nest doorbell camera was removed from the wall. No fumbling, no searching for it. Straight to it, straight off the wall, in and done. At 2:12 in the morning, motion was detected at the front of the property. At 2:28 in the morning, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker missed its scheduled transmission. 16 minutes. That is the window. 16 minutes between the first motion alert and the moment the pacemaker went silent.
I don't personally believe that he went there to kidnap her. I personally believe that it is a home invasion gone wrong. However, it appears that the FBI is working both angles, that it could have been a home invasion where they didn't want anything to do with her.
16 minutes in which an 84-year-old woman who required a walker to cross a room was moved through her own home, guided through the rear of the property, through the door that had been left open in advance, and taken from a house she had lived in for years. Coffindaffer's assessment of those 16 minutes was not dramatic. It was surgical. She said it directly. This level of speed, this level of control, this level of operational precision does not happen without knowledge. Knowledge of the layout, knowledge of Nancy's physical limitations, knowledge of exactly which route to use to move her out of that property as quickly and as quietly as possible. 16 minutes is nothing, unless you have already rehearsed it in your mind, unless you already know every step of the route, unless someone who had walked that property with Nancy Guthrie, who had sat beside her in those rooms, who had helped her from one chair to another, had already mapped every detail for the person moving through it in the dark. That is not a stranger's operation. Stop and sit with that for a moment. Because what Coffindaffer was describing was not a crime committed by someone who found Nancy Guthrie by accident. It was a crime that required an intimate blueprint, a blueprint that only one category of person could have provided: someone on the inside, someone trusted, someone whose presence in that home had never raised a single alarm. Now consider the rear doors again. Propped, not forced, propped. In Coffindaffer's 28 years of FBI work, propped doors at crime scenes carry a very specific meaning. They mean pre-access. They mean someone moved through that space before the event, with enough comfort and enough time to make a deliberate choice about which exit would be used later. A stranger cannot prop a door they have never stood behind. A stranger cannot unlock a rear entrance they have never been given access to. But someone who had been welcomed into that home before could do exactly that. Someone who, on a prior visit, had moved quietly to the rear of the property, assessed the door, and made a decision. Left it in a position that would matter later. Left it ready, and then walked back through the front door and said goodbye to Nancy Guthrie like nothing had happened. That image is the one that Jennifer Coffindafer could not let go of. Not the masked figure, not the surveillance footage, the image of someone saying goodbye to an 84-year-old woman at her front door, while behind them, somewhere in the back of that house, a door sat propped and waiting. The security of that home had not been broken from the outside. It had been quietly dismantled from within, and Coffindaffer knew that the person who had done that dismantling was not a stranger. Was not someone Nancy Guthrie would have feared. Was someone Nancy would have recognized. Someone she had no reason to distrust. Someone whose name, when it finally attached itself publicly to this investigation, would not land as a surprise to Jennifer Coffindafer. Because she had already been circling it. From day 2, she had been circling it. And 10 months before the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared, someone sitting at a keyboard had already started preparing for what was coming. They had typed her home address into a search engine. They had pulled up photographs of the exterior of her property, her driveway, her front entrance, the camera angles from the street. Not because they did not know what the house looked like. Because they needed to confirm something specific. And Jennifer Coffindafer, the woman who spent 28 years watching digital evidence crack cases that seemed impossible, had already identified what that confirmation was for. The trail from that keyboard did not disappear. It never does. March 2025, 10 months before Nancy Guthrie was taken from her bed, someone conducted an image search for her home address. They pulled up publicly available photographs of the exterior of her property. Her driveway, her front door, the sight lines from the street, the angles, the distances, the visibility from the road to the front entrance of a private residence in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. They studied it, and then they stopped. 10 months passed. November 30th, 2025. 60 days before the abduction. Someone did it again. The same address. The same exterior images. The same deliberate study of a property belonging to an 84-year-old woman who lived alone. 2 separate rounds. 10 months apart. This is where Jennifer Coffindaffer's analysis becomes something that changes the entire picture of this case. Because here is the question she asked publicly, calmly, with the weight of 28 years behind it. Who needs to research a house they already know? Think about that carefully. A complete stranger to Nancy Guthrie, someone with no prior connection, no knowledge of the property, no history with the family, would have every reason to conduct that kind of digital reconnaissance.
You see a complete reinvestigation, recanvassing. 2 times they go back and search. It doesn't look like they have the answers that the president speaks of, but then you never know what's going on behind the scenes. I do think law enforcement knows so much more than we know.
They would need to learn what the house looked like. They would need to understand the layout from the outside, identify the camera positions, study the entry points. For a stranger, that research makes complete sense. But now consider the other category of person. Someone who had been inside that house many times. Someone who had walked those hallways and sat in those rooms. Someone who already knew where the cameras were, where the doors were, how the property was laid out. For that person, running image searches of the exterior was not about learning anything new. It was about confirming something specific. Verifying a camera angle, checking a sightline, making sure that the approach already planned would work exactly the way it needed to work. Making sure the doorbell camera was positioned in a way that a downward tilted head would defeat. Making sure the approach from the street to the front door could be done in the right number of steps, at the right angle, without revealing anything that needed to stay hidden. That is preparation. That is not curiosity. The FBI subpoenaed Google for the IP address data connected to both sets of searches. The device, the account, the person who sat down at a keyboard on 2 separate occasions, 10 months apart, and deliberately researched the home of a woman who would later disappear from it under circumstances that Jennifer Coffindafer had already called targeted from day 2. That IP address is now in the hands of federal investigators. That account has a name attached to it. And Coffindaffer, who watched digital evidence dismantle the confidence of people who believed technology had made them invisible, said what investigators had not yet said publicly. The trail does not disappear. It never disappears. Now add the ransom notes. They were not sent to law enforcement privately. They were not delivered through a contained channel to the Guthrie family alone. They were sent to TMZ, to national broadcast networks, to news organizations with millions of daily viewers. A demand for $6 million in Bitcoin, distributed across the widest possible public audience. Coffindaffer's response to that distribution was immediate and cold. A kidnapper who is genuinely motivated by money negotiates privately. They keep the communication contained. They avoid the kind of public attention that dramatically multiplies the risk of being identified and caught. Public ransom demands are the opposite of what someone who wants to get paid actually does. So what does a public ransom demand actually mean? It means the goal was never the money. Coffindaffer said it directly. Public perception has been exceedingly important to the Guthrie family. The kidnappers seem to understand this. Read that sentence again. To understand that public perception matters enormously to the Guthrie family, you cannot be a stranger. You cannot be someone who watched Savannah Guthrie on television and built a theory. You have to know this family. You have to understand the specific weight that public exposure carries for them. You have to know that sending those notes to TMZ and national networks would place Savannah Guthrie in front of cameras looking helpless, looking pressured, looking like a daughter caught between a private nightmare and a national audience. That kind of precision is intimate. Then came the detail that stopped everyone paying close attention. There was no proof of life in any of the ransom notes. In kidnapping cases where the goal is a financial exchange, proof of life is not optional. It is the foundation of the negotiation. It is the mechanism that makes any demand credible. Without it, there is nothing to negotiate. Without it, the demand is hollow. Without it, there is no reason for any family to move a single dollar toward a Bitcoin wallet. The notes sent in the Nancy Guthrie case contained no proof that she was alive. No voice recording, no photograph, no detail that only Nancy could have provided. Nothing. Coffindaffer's interpretation of that absence was the darkest verdict she had delivered publicly to that point. She said the notes, the way they were written, the way they were distributed, the complete absence of any credible negotiation mechanism, pointed to someone who was not expecting to negotiate at all. Someone who already knew the outcome. Someone whose real objective had never been $6 million in Bitcoin. The objective was the family. The objective was to force Savannah Guthrie into the public eye in the worst possible position. To make a nationally recognized journalist stand in front of cameras with no answers, no control, and no ability to protect her own mother. To fracture something publicly that could not be put back together privately. That is not a kidnapping for profit. That is a targeted destruction. And to orchestrate a targeted destruction of that specific family, with that specific understanding of their public vulnerability, with that specific knowledge of how to make the pressure unbearable, you had to have been inside that world. Not observing it from outside, living inside it. The Bitcoin wallet received a small deposit on February 10, 2026. 9 days after Nancy disappeared. The message attached to that transaction read simply, "We are ready to talk." Blockchain forensics teams do not lose that kind of trail. Every transaction is permanent. Every wallet that ever connected to that address is visible. Every exchange that ever processed a transaction linked to it is part of a record that does not fade, does not corrupt, and does not disappear because someone wants it to. The FBI has that trail. The FBI has the Google IP address data. The FBI has the device records from 2 separate rounds of digital reconnaissance conducted 10 months apart. And Jennifer Coffindafer, in April of 2026, said something on record that the mainstream coverage of this case was not prepared to repeat at full volume. She pointed, not at the masked figure on the doorbell camera, not at the unknown male DNA profile recovered from the glove found 2 miles from Nancy's home. Not at a stranger, not at someone on the periphery of this case. She pointed at someone with a name, someone with access, someone who had been at that family dinner on the night of January 31, 2026. Someone who had watched Nancy Guthrie walk through her front door and go inside. And that name was Tommaso. Jennifer Coffindafer does not use language carelessly. 28 years inside the FBI will do that to a person. Every word she places on the record has been filtered through decades of professional discipline. She does not speculate for entertainment. She does not reach beyond what the evidence supports. When she speaks, it is because the evidence has already spoken first, and she is simply translating. So when she said in April of 2026 that the suspect in the Nancy Guthrie case had a God complex, it was not a provocative phrase chosen for an audience. It was a behavioral diagnosis. And it explained everything. A God complex in criminal psychology is not arrogance in the ordinary sense. It is a specific profile. A person who believes so completely in the superiority of their own planning that they stop accounting for the things they cannot control. They stop anticipating the thread they did not think mattered. They make moves not out of necessity, but out of a compulsion to demonstrate their own intelligence. To prove, over and over, to themselves and to anyone watching, that they are beyond consequence. Look at the ransom notes going to TMZ. That was not a necessary operational move. Sending those notes to a national entertainment news outlet served no financial purpose. It created risk. It widened the circle of exposure dramatically. But it also put the Guthrie family on a national stage in the most painful possible position. And that, Coffindaffer explained, was the signature of someone who could not resist the performance. Someone who needed the audience. Someone who believed the performance was safe because they were too intelligent to be caught. Look at the propped rear door. The confidence embedded in that act is extraordinary when you examine it clearly. To prop a door open inside a secured private residence, days or hours before an abduction, and leave it that way, requires a level of certainty that most people simply do not possess. It requires the absolute belief that nothing will go wrong before the operation begins. That nobody will check that door. That Nancy will not notice. That the plan is so perfectly constructed that even the preparation can be left in place. That is not careful criminal thinking. That is a God complex in physical form. Look at the digital reconnaissance. 2 rounds, 10 months apart, conducted on a device connected to an account. Searches that left an IP address trail that the FBI subpoenaed and recovered in full. Someone with ordinary criminal caution would have used a public network. Would have used an unregistered device. Would have made that research impossible to trace back to a specific person at a specific location. But someone with a God complex does not take those precautions. Because they do not believe they will need to. They believe the trail will never matter because they will never be the person investigators are looking for. They believe their position, their relationships, their public standing places them in a category that law enforcement does not reach. They believe they have constructed the perfect distance between themselves and the crime. Coffindaffer has watched that belief collapse before. Many times. She explained the two-person structure of this operation with a clarity that cut through everything the public coverage had been circling around without landing on. She said plainly, this was not a solo operation. There is someone orchestrating this entire situation. The masked figure on the doorbell camera, the individual investigators had publicly identified as the physical suspect, was not the architect. He was the instrument, the person who carried out the physical elements of the abduction. But behind him, coordinating, planning, providing information, directing decisions, was someone else entirely. Someone more composed. Someone with more to lose. Someone who understood that direct involvement in what happened to Nancy Guthrie would be catastrophic, and who had therefore constructed a layer of distance between themselves and the physical crime. That person is the reason the masked suspect walked directly to the doorbell camera without searching for it. That person is the reason the rear door was already open. That person is the reason the approach happened at 1:47 in the morning, precisely inside the window after Nancy would have gone to sleep and before her pacemaker transmission would alert anyone that something had changed. Nobody walks into a private residence at that hour with that level of precision unless someone who knew every detail of that home and every detail of that woman's nightly routine provided a complete operational map. The orchestrator provided that map, and the orchestrator believed, with total certainty, that the distance they had created was enough. That the masked figure between them and the crime was enough. That the God complex that had driven every decision in this case, from the early reconnaissance to the public ransom notes, had placed them somewhere law enforcement could not reach. Coffindaffer has seen that certainty before. She has watched it sit across a table from federal investigators and still believe, even in that moment, that it is going to walk out of the room untouched. It does not. Law enforcement sources, confirmed by Coffindaffer publicly in her own words, had known who the subject was for some time before any public announcement. The reason no arrest had been made was not because the investigation had lost direction. It was because the case being constructed at Quantico, the DNA processed through probabilistic genotyping software, the cell tower data assembled by the FBI's cell site analysis unit, the blockchain forensics trail attached to the Bitcoin wallet, the Google IP address records, all of it needed to be constructed without a single gap. Because the person at the center of this case would not walk into a courtroom without resources, without attorneys, without a public platform and the means to challenge every piece of evidence presented, without the God complex that would still be operating, even then, telling them they could find a way out. Coffindaffer was not going to let that happen. She had watched cases fall apart before because prosecutors moved before the evidence was sealed. She had watched people she knew were responsible walk because the timeline had one hole in it that a skilled defense attorney turned into an exit. She was not going to watch it happen here. The DNA was at Quantico. The cell tower data was being cross-referenced. The blockchain trail was being followed transaction by transaction. The IP address sat in a federal record with a name and a device attached to it. Every thread was still attached. And a God complex, Coffindaffer said, always produces the same final error. The person who believes they cannot be caught always leaves the one detail they were certain would never matter. In this case, one of those details was already in federal hands. The person who orchestrated the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie from her home on the morning of February 1, 2026 had left threads in places they were absolutely certain no one would ever look. Jennifer Coffindafer had been looking since day 2. And she was not finished yet. There is a question that anyone following Jennifer Coffindaffer's public involvement in the Nancy Guthrie case eventually arrives at. Why? She is a retired FBI special agent. She does not need the exposure. She does not need the platform. She spent 28 years doing this work quietly, inside an institution, without a camera pointed at her face. She built cases in rooms the public never saw, against people the public never heard about, and she did that work without any of the attention that comes with putting her name on a news segment or a published interview. So why Nancy Guthrie? The answer is not complicated. But it is heavy. Jennifer Coffindafer watched this case get mishandled in real time. And she could not stay quiet. The crime scene at Nancy Guthrie's home was left unsecured in the critical early hours of the investigation. A national television crew walked up to the front door of an active abduction scene and knocked on it. The blood present at the front entrance, later confirmed as Nancy's, was accessible to anyone who approached the property. The most sensitive physical evidence of what had happened at that door was exposed to foot traffic, to weather, to contamination, in the hours when it was most irreplaceable. Coffindaffer said it without softening it. There are no do-overs in crime scenes. Whatever evidence existed on that property in the first 12 hours, whatever trace materials, whatever physical record of the events at that front door, was placed at risk by the absence of proper scene security. And in a case where every thread mattered, where every physical detail was a potential connection to the person responsible, the loss of even one piece of that record carried consequences that could not be undone. Then came the DNA. A glove was recovered approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. It appeared to match the gloves worn by the masked figure in the doorbell footage. It was processed for DNA. An unknown male profile was recovered from that glove, a profile that did not match anyone in the federal database. The next step should have been immediate. The evidence should have gone directly to the FBI laboratory at Quantico, the most advanced forensic facility in the country, equipped with capabilities that no private laboratory can replicate. Probabilistic genotyping software, specialized mixture analysis, the full technical infrastructure of the most powerful law enforcement agency on Earth. Instead, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos sent the DNA evidence to a private laboratory in Florida. 11 weeks passed. 11 weeks during which the most critical piece of physical evidence in this investigation sat in the wrong building. While an 84-year-old woman who required daily medication to manage a serious heart condition had been missing for days, then weeks, then months. Coffindaffer called it what it was: a failure of professional judgment that cost the investigation time it could not recover. When the evidence finally reached Quantico, it came after public pressure, after congressional attention, after Sheriff Nanos was questioned under oath. Coffindaffer's response to that sequence was measured but unsparing. She said the FBI was starting from scratch with evidence that should have been in their hands from the beginning. That is why she spoke. Not for the cameras, not for the audience, because she had spent 28 years understanding what happens to cases when institutional failures compound in the early stages of an investigation. She had seen what an unsecured crime scene costs. She had seen what 11 weeks in the wrong laboratory costs. She had seen what happens to families when the system that is supposed to protect them moves too slowly in the moments that define whether justice is possible. She spoke because Nancy Guthrie deserved someone with 28 years of FBI experience standing in front of a microphone and refusing to let the public look away. She spoke because the case was not cold. In March of 2026, a quiet narrative began threading through media coverage of the disappearance. A suggestion that the investigation had stalled, that leads had gone quiet, that after 40 days, 50 days, 60 days, the momentum had faded. Coffindaffer pushed back with everything she had. She went on record publicly. This case is red hot. It is not cold. It will never be cold as long as Nancy Guthrie is missing. And she explained exactly why. The FBI had DNA at Quantico being processed through probabilistic genotyping technology. Software that does not simply compare a sample against an existing database but builds statistical models from complex mixture evidence and isolates individual contributor profiles with mathematical precision that was not available to investigators even a decade ago. The FBI had cell tower data being assembled by the Bureau's Cell Site Analysis Unit, a specialized team that maps the digital footprint of every mobile device active in a geographic area during a specific time window. Every phone near the Catalina foothills on the night of January 31st and the early morning of February 1, 2026, is inside that dataset. Every movement, every signal, every record of where those devices were and precisely when. The FBI had the Google subpoena records. The IP address from the March 2025 searches. The IP address from the November 2025 searches. The device. The account. The person. The FBI had the Bitcoin wallet. A blockchain trail that does not fade, does not corrupt, and does not disappear because someone needs it to. Every transaction permanent, every connected wallet visible, every exchange that ever touched that address part of a record that federal forensic teams were working through in real time. 95 days since Nancy Guthrie disappeared. She is 84 years old. She requires medication. She has a heart condition that places weight on every passing day that most people following this case do not allow themselves to fully sit with. Because sitting with it fully means acknowledging something that Coffindaffer had already acknowledged professionally, in her own words, on the record. She said it clearly. Finding Nancy alive was Objective 1. Objective 2 is getting the person responsible off the streets. That is the verdict of a retired FBI special agent who has examined every piece of publicly available evidence in this case and reached a conclusion that she was willing to attach her name to. Somewhere in this investigation, a thread is being pulled right now. The DNA at Quantico. The cell tower data being mapped against known individuals. The blockchain forensics team working the Bitcoin wallet transaction by transaction. The Google IP address sitting in a federal record with a name and a device attached to it. The behavioral profile of an orchestrator with a god complex who left details in places they were certain nobody would ever look. One of those threads is going to break this open. Jennifer Coffindafer has watched that moment happen before. She has sat in rooms where the evidence finally closed around the person who believed they were beyond reach. She has seen the god complex meet the one detail it did not account for. She is watching for that moment now. And when it comes, when the name that she has been circling since day 2 of this investigation attaches itself fully and publicly to what happened to Nancy Guthrie on the morning of February 1, 2026, the question that will follow is the one that has been sitting underneath every piece of analysis Coffindaffer has offered since the beginning. How did they think they were going to get away with it? The answer to that question is coming. And it is darker than anything the footage, the notes, or the forensic timeline has shown publicly so far. There is a piece of this case that has not been reported. A detail connected to the person Coffindaffer has been pointing toward that changes the motive entirely. Not just what happened, not just who did it. Why this family? Why this woman? Why now? That answer is in the next video. And if you have followed this case from the beginning, it is the one piece you cannot afford to miss.